So topic 1 is, now we talked a little bit about weight cutting in the last one and about potential penalties that should be incurred for fighters that miss weight, whether on purpose or accidentally. So I thought we'd take that question a little bit further and ask the question, should we just ban weight cutting altogether, and should fighters be forced to fight at their natural weight? What do we think about this one?
This one's tough. I would say no. I think that weight cutting should still be there, but I think that there should be some sort of regulations in place, and the UFC kind of loosely does this in a sense, but there should be regulations in place to make sure that people aren't cutting too much weight. For instance, when Anthony Johnson, rest in peace, was cutting weight down to welterweight, good Lord, why in the world would that man cut that much weight? That's not even healthy. His leg
looks like a welterweight.
Yeah, like he looks so much better at light heavyweight. And so, things like that where it's not, I know people bring up weight bullying, but to me, if you make the weight, you make the weight. But when it becomes a situation where it's just unhealthy for the fighter and they start missing weight at just religiously, just every time that there's a fight, people are talking more about the weigh-in than the actual fight itself. I think that they should be forced to move to a different division, and the UFC loosely does that. But I think that weight cutting should still be there because I believe that that's part of the fight. I believe that suffering that they have to go through to get to that weigh-in, we've often heard that is the first fight that they must get through, and I think that that's just part of the entire experience. So I don't think it should be banned, but I think it should be monitored very closely to make sure that these fighters are fighting at a weight that is optimal to their performance and to their health.
Yeah, no, that's some really good points there. I think, again, I was thinking along very similar lines, and I'm very much leaning on the side of no, purely, again, we're talking about something that's very, very impossible to police. As long as there are weight divisions in existence, which there should be, of course, because the last thing you want are fighters going in there that can be completely different weights, because you'd have a bloodbath on your hands pretty much every time if that was allowed to occur. So as long as there's weight divisions, which there has to be, there's always going to be weight cutting. I will say this though, I think fighters fighting at a natural weight is more safe for athletes, which is something you've talked about and alluded to there, about making sure that measures are in place to make sure that weight cutting is not done to dangerous levels, because there have been studies since that say depriving the brain and whatnot can lead to, you've got a higher chance of being KO'd and ill health down the line, damage to the organs and whatnot. And again, we don't really know the full long-term effects, because they have been linked to potentially enhancing CTE as well, because obviously if you're draining yourself down, depriving yourself of water and therefore oxygen, you're obviously also enhancing the damage you receive, both short-term and long-term, when you get smacked in the head by somebody. But there are other benefits to fighting at your natural weight as well. It's kind of known that a lot of fighters that certainly have a massive weight cut, they spend large parts of their camp cutting weight instead of skill building. So if weight cutting was eliminated entirely, we could see fighters operating at their optimum best. So it may actually increase the quality of the product we actually see. Now, a lot of this is conjecture, and I will say this, what I'd kind of like to see is maybe see a smaller promotion trialing it out and to impose like the following rules. So you could have fighters have to weigh in as they usually do, say the day before. And then to prove they're not cheating or rehydrating for a fight, they need to be weighed just before the bout. And then you can then have a penalty system depending on what happens in between them. Now, if people are being true to their word and fighting it there, you'd obviously have to have some kind of window. So you could maybe say there's a certain amount of weight that you're allowed to gain, because sometimes people will weigh in on a certain night and then they go and have a massive steak that evening, and then suddenly they weigh 10 pounds more. It's a very, very difficult thing to gauge. But so I wouldn't want it to be a case of we're weighing on fight night and then fights are getting cancelled, because that would be a problem in itself. We have a lot of last minute cancellations as it is. And you could, it could be determined what the sanctions could be regarding that. But as I said, if people are going in at their natural weight, it should be something that doesn't happen too regularly. Ultimately, I kind of see it being a miss, but it could be a unique selling point for like an up and coming promotion and like an interesting experiment, like at best. If you're like an up and coming promotion that is trying to make traction, you could have that as your selling point and say, look, we're abolishing weight cutting, and we just want people who are coming in there, fighting at their natural weight and focusing on skill building, and then seeing where it can go. And I think that could be potentially something interesting. But as far as banning it from the sport, it never should happen. It's never going to happen. And from that perspective, I kind of like things the way they are, as long as things are regulated properly.
True. And I think that, your point as far as like other organizations experimenting with that to see what works, that's where I feel like the UFC as a sport, as being the leader in the MMA space, kind of fails the other organizations or the sport as a whole by not allowing or partnering with other organizations to push things forward, to experiment on rules, to make the sport safer and better for the athletes. I think that there's a reason that the UFC is still labeled as a promotion versus a league. And this is one of the instances that really highlights why they are labeled that, because their motivation is more about profit. And I understand that, but if you better the sport, then you'll make a better profit. The NFL is an example of that. The Major League Baseball is an example of that. And using Major League Baseball as an example, they experiment with their minor leagues for rules just like these. They experimented with them for instant replay, which we talked about in the previous on part 1. And they experimented with a variety of things that they brought into the major leagues that helped the game as a whole. And if the UFC wants to better the product, then they should partner with these other organizations to experiment on things like this, on things like instant replay, a variety of other things that will make the sport better. So there's a way to make this work, because obviously weight cutting is an issue. People have died from weight cutting. They need to police these things. And I think that there's probably a happy medium when it comes to this, to make sure that people aren't cutting weight that's going to be detrimental to their health. So I totally agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like what, again, as sometimes, we do come across as people who are like bloodthirsty monsters who just want to see carnage and destruction. But I think most of us would agree that, again, ultimately what we want is for the safety of the fighters to be paramount before our entertainment. And that can be something that's very difficult to admit from time to time, because it sounds like an obvious thing to say, but like, we do forget that there's a lot of the human side involved, and there are people that have families, and there are people that are willing to, once they've dedicated themselves to something this dangerous, they're willing to go to whatever lengths it takes to be successful and to make money from it. And a lot of them do have the attitude of, well, it doesn't matter how much damage I do to myself in the next X, Y, and Z, as long as I get that modicum of success now, and that's something that this would help to eradicate.
Yeah, and plus, you know what, that it really protects people's careers. You brought up the damage that cutting weight can do to somebody's brain by reducing the fluid around it. I mean, we've seen that in when TJ Dillashaw, he did everything possible to cut weight, including using EPO, and still got knocked out viciously. And it's because of that fluid that he lost around his brain, and he hasn't been the same. Look at Cody Garbrandt. He went down to 125, and he hasn't been the same since. So these things happen, and we're seeing them play out in real time. And if they want to protect these fighters to make sure that they're doing the best thing for their health, then these things should be in place.
Absolutely. I think we're in full agreement on that.